Well, thank you. Good morning. It's my absolute pleasure to be with you today. And even though I'm over 1,000 miles from home, I feel quite at home amongst this community. I was once an elected councillor. You can see the picture here on the screen. I was elected when I was 21. You can't probably see here, but I was also 6 months pregnant. That was quite a challenge. I think if I'd known what I knew or what I know now about motherhood, or being in local politics, I probably wouldn't have done either. Both are incredibly challenging. But I take my hat off to those of you coming into public service, and we do that not for the glory. I think that's what a lot of people out there amongst the general public might often think, but it's not actually very glamorous at all. We do it because we want to make a difference, and we want to make things better for people. And I suppose the question that I want to pose today is, who do we want to make things better for? Now, I often like to start what I'm going to say about future generations with one of my own future generations. This isn't the one in my stomach then at age 21. This is 5 on, so 5 children, 4 boys. This is my daughter, Belle. I obviously must have liked something about motherhood, mustn't I? And I like this image, really, of Belle. She's 11 now. She was probably about 6 then, because it really sums up for me how I would like all of our future generations to be growing up. So she's happy, she's healthy, she's connected with nature, she's pretty sassy because she's got to manage her older brothers. But if we think about the kind of reality of where we are now and what might be facing our future generations, even just looking over to this last year, there are many things which are destabilizing our planet and society. So, in the last year, we've seen big rise in geopolitical tensions, breakdown of democracy. I've just come here straight from Chicago, where I've spent the last 2 days with a range of philanthropists working on the future of democracy in the US. You can imagine that was a tough gig. Of course, here, the rise of technology. Obviously, you've had this devastating train accident here in Norway, issues there around the future and the resilience of our infrastructure. You've had also a citizens panel which recommended looking at the future of your sovereign wealth fund, which actually recommended that a Future Generations Act approach could be adopted here, and I'll tell you more about that in a moment. And of course, Taylor Swift completed her Eras tour. But if we look at the kind of intersection between all of these things, most of these things were entirely kind of predictable, if you like. And often we wring our hands and think, well, we can't predict the future, and these are, 1 in 100-year moments and so on. But actually, they're not those things. They are things that if we deployed a long-term mindset, and if we started testing all of our decisions in terms of how they're going to play out for the future, they are things that absolutely could be predicted. But it's just that our systems of governance are really bad at doing that. So hence why we're in this polycrisis. And if we look at the kind of intersection between all of the different challenges that we're facing at the moment, that turns into this polycrisis. So the intersection between an aging population who are more vulnerable to the effects of climate change through heat. Obviously, these are people who will be in your communities who will require your health and social care services in much greater numbers because of the demographic changes and the increased life expectancy, but also because of those conditions. If we look at the geopolitical instability that we're experiencing now, trade tariffs and various other things, and the fact, the underlying causes of why is populism on the rise, why are we seeing these really worrying shifts? Well, I would say that is in part due to a failed economic system that is not bringing everyone up and is generally only benefiting the few. So really, we're no longer heading towards a smooth or linear transition. What lies ahead is volatile, uncertain, and spiky, and it's marked by rupture rather than reform. And that is kind of the reality of the challenge. But the question, therefore, that I think we need to try and address today, or at least start thinking about today, is how, therefore, do we do policy by design rather than disaster? Now, we can do that, we want to do that for both current generations and future generations in particular, and you see this with the kind of decline in trust in institutions, particularly so across all generations, but particularly so across younger generations. Now, as a mum of 4 boys, I like a bit of British hip-hop, and this is a pretty cool British hip-hop artist called Loyal Kana, and I think he's speaking for a lot of future generations, where he's saying, never has so much been lost by so many because of the inaction of so few. So when we're talking about future generations, who are we actually talking about? Well, if we look 50,000 years to the past, there have been about 100 million people who were once alive and are now dead. There's about 8.2 billion of us on planet Earth at the moment, but if we look 50,000 years to the future, there are about 6.75 trillion people yet to be born. And the reality is, what the 8.2 billion of us on planet Earth, and actually quite a smaller number of that in terms of those who hold the power, those who can take decisions, many of you in this room, we will determine the sorts of lives that those 6.75 trillion people who are yet to be born will live or may not live if we carry on as we're going. But I'm often asked, particularly when we think about some of the big challenges we're facing in the here and now, when we think about some of those even bigger challenges in global majority countries, in the global south, debt, poverty, and so on, how can we create space to think about future generations when there are so many challenges for current generations? Well, I like to look at the way we approach to futures thinking through the life course. So I'm a 47-year-old woman. Hopefully, I will be a future generation of an 87-year-old woman. And the way in which public policy interacts with me now, does it create the conditions for me to thrive into old age? Does it enable me to stay healthy, to make good choices, to stay healthy? Does it build the sorts of communities in terms of designs of the homes that we're building now, which will meet my needs when I am 87? Does it build those connected and cohesive communities? Is it tackling climate change so that I'm not feeling the effects of heat-related illness and so on? But likewise, it's also about our younger generations. We know that for every pound that we invest in early intervention, in those first 1,000 days of life, we reap significant benefits later on in life. And there are multiple concerns and issues throughout the life course, but really what I'm talking about today is how we can take that long-term view, how we can get upstream of problems, and how that can be better both for current and future generations. Now, some of you might have seen this term VUCA. It stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. If you haven't heard of that term, I think it probably will still speak to the sorts of environment that you're operating in at the moment. So multiple challenges coming your way in terms of that volatility. We're not quite certain where things are going to go. Everything is complex. Everything is connected to everything. Everyone wants that one thing, that golden or silver bullet that's going to address the problem, but that doesn't exist in reality because everything is really complex. And things are quite ambiguous too. So if we're to turn that on its head in terms of what are the solutions, therefore, if things are volatile, we actually need a vision. We need to be saying, okay, things might be coming down the track at us, but where is it in the long term that we're going? And when I talk about the long term, I mean beyond an electoral cycle, beyond several electoral cycles. What's that North Star that even when the things are coming down the track at us, we're still heading in that way? With uncertainty, we need better understanding, and understanding comes through connection and conversations. It involves speaking with the unusual suspects. It involves speaking, dare I say, with our younger generations, because if we'd listened to our younger generations 10, 15 years ago, when I first started as Future Generations Commissioner in 2016, there were 3 things that our younger generations always told me were their concerns: mental health, climate, and skills, the sorts of education system they were operating within. And then fast forward to 2025, and we're all surprised that there's a mental health crisis amongst our young people. So this connection and listening, really, really important. Complexity, that connection enables us to clarify. It enables us to think about what are the things that might be coming and the intersections between them, and then agility. And I think I would really pose the question here of how fit are our public sector bureaucracies, our governance, to be agile in this changing world. There's a real need for reform in that regard. So, how, therefore, do we shift a whole country to a system which supports the well-being of future generations? So welcome to Wales, Groeso I Gymru, the first country in the world to have legislated to protect the interests of future generations. In 2015, we passed groundbreaking legislation called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, and it does a number of things. So first off, it sets out this overarching principle that all of our public bodies, in their decision-making, must seek to meet today's needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Basically, what we're saying here, we don't know exactly what future generations will want. As Future Generations Commissioner is a much easier gig in some ways than having an elected constituency, because they didn't ring me to complain that often, and they didn't write me nasty emails or send me messages on X. Maybe at some point we'll develop an AI in which the unborn can speak to the next Future Generations Commissioner. But we don't know exactly what they want. But what we're trying to do is to make sure that we're not closing off options to them. And we can probably guess at some fairly basic things they want: clean air to breathe, a planet to live on, and so on. The legislation then sets out 7 long-term well-being goals. And these goals were developed through a national conversation with the citizens of Wales. So we posed the question to citizens: what is the Wales you want to leave behind to your children, your grandchildren, and future generations to come? And that's quite an unusual conversation for governments at any level to have with their citizens. We usually ask them about particular policies or ideas. We don't have that broad conversation about the future. So it was done through what we call called a hub and spoke model. So we recruited hundreds of futures champions across Wales who hosted their own conversations in town halls, in round tables, working with schools. So school children were writing letters to their future selves. They were designing their ideal future community using Minecraft, and a range of other things. And the people of Wales came up with these principles, which then went into these 7 long-term well-being goals. Now, there's a few things that I want to pull out of interest about these goals. The first thing is that the duty rests on our government at Welsh Government level, down through to all of our municipalities and all of our public institutions in between. So our Public Health Agency, our Sports Council, our Arts Council, our Environment Agency, and so on. They all have duties to set objectives which maximise their contribution to all 7 of these wellbeing goals. And that's the first game changer in the legislation. It's basically saying every one of those institutions has to act beyond their traditional boundaries, if you like. And that's because everything is connected to everything. If we want to meet the goal of a healthier Wales, we're not going to be able to do that unless we address socioeconomic disadvantage, unless we create decent jobs, unless we maintain planetary stability and ecosystems, and so on. So it's really saying, if you are the economy department in government, it's not just your duty to develop a strong economy, it's your duty to do that within planetary boundaries and in a way which is contributing to positive outcomes in terms of equity, in terms of health, and so on. The second game changer in terms of these goals, I'm going to pull out that goal of a prosperous Wales. A productive, innovative, low-carbon society which uses resources efficiently and proportionately, acts on climate change, develops a well-educated population with the skills to enable them to access decent work. Now, that's not a very catchy definition, I'll give you that. But what's most interesting, actually, is what it doesn't say. So there's no reference in this definition of prosperity to GDP or to growth. What we're saying in Wales is that growth might be a contributor to achieving those goals, but it is not the goal in of itself. And this is where I think many of our systems have gone fundamentally wrong. So the welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measure of national income. That was the kind of Simon Kuznets who first developed GDP in the US in 1934. And yet so much of what we hook our kind of actions onto a growth. How often do you hear the media talk about the latest growth predictions or outcomes as compared to how you hear us or the media talk about the latest climate predictions or whether we're meeting our carbon emissions targets and so on. So that new definition of what we mean by prosperity, incredibly important in our legislation. Now, the third game changer about this is that it basically sets a North Star for where we want to go. It's saying this is the vision for the Wales that we want to leave behind to future generations, and all of the decisions we take have to be tested on whether they're going to help or hinder us reach that vision. And someone, when I started describing this, someone said to me, oh, it's like your Google Maps. You put in an address in your Google Maps if you want to go somewhere. And Google Maps is now clever enough that it will divert you if there's a roadblock. It might take you, it gives you options of going on a more scenic route or via particular places if you want to pick people up and so on. But ultimately, it's going to get you to where you want to go. Now, the problem with most governments and most countries is that they have no idea where they want to go. They have no idea of the address that they're putting into Google Maps. And this quote, I think, is a really good one. You've got to think about the big things while you're doing the little things so that all the little things go in the right direction. Because without that vision, how do we know how all of our smaller decisions are stacking up to achieving the sort of municipality, country, world that we want to leave behind? Now, the next thing in the legislation is there are 5 principles for decision-making. So long-term is the first one. Statutory requirement to consider the long-term impact of the things that you do. So this image here is really showing, so over here is the vision. What we're trying to do is backcast from the vision. If this is where we want to be and we're here now, what are the steps we need to take to get to where we want to go? In that middle section, there's a whole load of stuff that could be happening that we might not be aware of, we might not have considered, might be kind of unusual events and so on, might be entirely predictable events that we just haven't considered. So it's that ability to have a foresight mindset, to be considering all of these different things and then taking a decision on, okay, what is the best way of moving forward to take us towards those goals. The next principle is prevention. So a requirement to prevent problems from occurring or from getting worse. And generally, again, we're really bad at doing this. Most public policy and public services park their ambulance at the bottom of a cliff and wait for people to fall off. And then we spend a huge amount of money fixing their broken legs or whatever it might be when they've fallen off. When the obvious thing to do is to put a fence at the top of the cliff to stop people falling off in the first place. Now, that's much easier said than done, and this is the challenge that you're all grappling with. On the one hand, you've got this increasing demand and reducing finances, and then you're trying to find the headspace for prevention. Now, I've become quite attracted to this concept of radical incrementalism. So what we have here is a kind of radical approach. But actually, how can we do that? The reality is that we need to manage change in an incremental way. And I hold my hands up to those who will criticize and say we haven't got time for incrementalism. We don't in terms of the planet. But actually, as someone who's worked in public service all her life, I also know the realities of what we're all trying to grapple with. But if we think about that radical incrementalism, how do we start shifting our spend away from the acute towards prevention? And what are the things that we can do in a joined-up manner. And that comes on to the third principle of integration. So a requirement on all of those public bodies to work together, the fourth principle, collaboration, to consider the connections between different issues. Now, this is taken from the World Health Organization Health Equity Status Report, and it looks at the reasons for the differences in life expectancy. So why do some people live to a ripe old age, and why do some people die younger than they should? And what this is showing us is that the biggest factor in that is poverty and income security. It makes up 35% of the differences in life expectancy. 29% is about your living conditions, so the quality of your home. Do you live in an area of high air pollution? Do you have access to nature? And so on. 19% is about social and human capital. What's the quality of your relationships? Do you have people you can turn to in your hour of need? Do you have a sense of agency that you can make a difference in the community that you live? 7% is about the quality of work. Far from governments just thinking any old job will do, bring in inward investment because it creates jobs. Actually, it's the quality of those jobs which is really important. And there we see at the top, only 10% of what makes a difference to life expectancy is the healthcare system itself. And yet most countries, in the global north in particular, are investing most of their money in that healthcare system. Now, I love our national health system in the UK as much as anyone else, but the reality is there's a real disparity between how we make a difference to people's health and where the money is going. So that radical incrementalism in terms of shifting things, critically important, and that collaboration becomes really important in that context, because actually what we do in terms of welfare, in terms of social security, in terms of considering perhaps some radical things like a universal basic income, could make a huge difference to people's health. Housing policy is also health policy. The way in which we plan and design our communities based around cars or based around public transport and active travel. The way in which we build communities to be connected and cohesive, and the way in which we support and facilitate that, absolutely crucial. All of those things are outside of the healthcare system, and that's why we need those other organizations having that lens in what they do. I've talked about collaboration. The legislation establishes something called public services boards, so we're bringing together of key public service institutions in each municipality or regional area with individual duties and collective duties on where can they act together to achieve these goals. And then finally, involvement. So a requirement to involve citizens in the decision-making process. And again, this image kind of often sums up how we do things. We don't always get policy right if we don't speak to people. We do it with well-intentioned, with good intentions. I can remember in my early career being part of designing a policy to provide free breakfasts to kids in school. Which I was very proud of at the time. And some of the evidence or the reason for this policy was to say there are many of our kids, particularly in those lower income families, who are not having a decent breakfast before they come to school. And that's impacting upon their learning and so on and so on. So we implemented this free breakfast scheme right across Wales. The problem is that the kids that we really wanted to benefit from, their parents weren't in work. So they weren't getting their child to school half an hour before school started, and they weren't benefiting from the free breakfast. And it was actually people like me who were just using it for half an hour's free childcare in the morning who benefited from it. Now, it's still, a good policy, but it was poorly designed, and therefore, if we'd asked those people, if we'd engaged with them, we would have perhaps come up with a different solution. Perhaps free school meals during the middle of the school day would be a better option. That is something that we have now done, by the way. So, the importance of user experience. I want to talk a little bit about this model called the 3 horizons. So this is a useful way of perhaps thinking about how you test your approach to policies or ideas that you have for improving things. Now, if we, at the red line, if we carry on with business as usual, there are many things that are on a downward trajectory. I started off with those in terms of some of the big crises and challenges that are facing us if we don't start to reform. The green line, horizon Horizon 3 is the new normal, and here's the trick. In Wales, we know what we want that new normal to be. It's the North Star, it's the vision of where we want to go. You could equally have that as the SDGs, or whatever a long-term collective vision that ideally you would develop with citizens. And Horizon 2, the blue one in the middle, is the thing really which is the bridge between Horizon 1 and Horizon 3. What are the things we're going to do? What are the innovations? They could be technological innovations that we want to advance towards meeting those goals. They could be policy innovations. They could be public service reform innovations. But the test is really that we really need to test whether those things are actually helping us to get towards that Horizon 3, or if they're just reinforcing the status quo. So to give you an example, if your mission is to decarbonise the transportation system, it's entirely sensible to put a lot of investment into electric vehicles. And I know you've got very high rates of EV here. We're much far behind in the UK. But actually, if we think about that in terms of actually what we want to achieve is we want to improve people's health as well as decarbonising transport. And we want to have connected communities. And we want to address equity. Actually, putting all of your money in an EV basket is just reinforcing the status quo. It's taken us back to Horizon 1 because we're all still sat in congestion in our electric vehicles rather than our petrol vehicles, not talking to each other and getting fatter. When actually what we could be doing is investing that money in public transport and active travel, which improves people's health, which brings people together in a connected way. And by the way, if you're from a poorer family and you couldn't afford a petrol vehicle, you definitely can't afford an electric vehicle. So it's about addressing equity as well. So this test of the 3 horizons is really useful to be thinking about this. And that was a live issue in one of the first big tests of how our legislation was going to play out in Wales. So the government had a plan to spend the entire of their borrowing capacity building a 13-mile stretch of motorway to deal with the problem of congestion at the M4 around one of our cities called Newport. Now, you know, this is not new news to many people. This is what we do. We have congestion, we build another road, and then in 10 to 15 years, that road is just as full as the previous road because we haven't really, and we had lowest levels of all of the UK nations in terms of investment in public transport. So as the Future Generations Commissioner, I intervened in that issue and I asked the government to explain to me how they'd applied those 7 wellbeing goals, achievement of those 7 wellbeing goals, to this decision. Can you explain to me how this meets the goal of a prosperous Wales, productive, innovative, low-carbon society? Because we build a road and carbon emissions goes up. Can you explain to me how it's in line with the goal of a resilient Wales, enhancing, maintaining, restoring ecosystems? This picture here is the Gwent Levels, a nature reserve where the road was due to be built. Can you explain to me how it's in line with a healthier Wales? Because we've already got illegal levels of air pollution. We build a road, those will go up. And we've got these increasing rates of obesity. So explain to me how you've considered that there. And also, can you explain to me how it's in line with the goal of a more equal Wales? Because 25% of the lowest income families in that region don't own a car. So are you going to spend the entire of the government's borrowing capacity on a project that benefits only the already better off? So to cut a long story short, and this is quite novel because generally when the first thing that happens with these issues is it's pitched as an economy versus environment argument, when you actually start considering wider and more holistic sense of well-being, actually you logically come to a different conclusion. So the government changed their minds and they cancelled the road building scheme, and then we went further to look at all of the infrastructure investment plan for the country and the transport strategy. We cancelled 51 of 55 pre-approved road building schemes because it didn't stack up with delivering that. That money that would have been spent on building roads is being reinvested in public transport, and the first of our new metro system has come online earlier this year. What we're showing here really is that we have these really kind of complex intersections. And when we start to consider things holistically, both in terms of how our policies will play out for a wider sense of well-being, rather than just those economy versus whatever argument, and when we start thinking about how those things play out over time, then it provides a useful framework for a different set of decisions to be taken. I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the other things that this is starting to flush out. So when we think about education and skills, so we have reformed our school curriculum based around those principles in the Future Generations Act. We want to develop ambitious and capable learners. And this is really looking to the future and saying that our children and young people need to develop a love of learning, because learning, lifelong learning, will need to become the new norm. We want them to be enterprising and creative contributors, because creativity is going to be a superpower in the future, far from it being the thing that we kind of do in the school curriculum if we've got time. When we're working alongside AI and robots, human creativity is a superpower for the future. When we think about health of our children, investing in that during our school curriculum, critically important for them to be able to thrive later in life. And then ethical and informed citizens. Imagine if every one of our world leaders had been through an education system which taught them to be ethical and informed citizens. Would we be in the crisis that we're in now? But also intersecting that across a range of different issues. So qualification reform, lowering the voting age to 16 to really try to sort of prime that democratic participation. Free school meals, a focus on addressing adverse childhood experiences, particularly in the first 1,000 days, and a guarantee for young people to be in education or training between 16 and 25. And then if we look at the green transition and a circular economy, how would you approach this through the lens of thinking holistically about well-being? We set an aspiration to be a zero-waste nation as part of a kind of circular economy. We're already very good at our rates of recycling, but actually we need to go fully circular. And if you pose the question, how do we become zero waste whilst also contributing to a range of other things, the sorts of ideas that have come up through that policy is investing in the library of things. Benthyg is the Welsh word for borrow, so we can all come together as communities and borrow things that we might all keep in our garages and our attics and maybe only use once a year, rather than owning them, which cost planetary resources to produce and then likely to end up in landfill. Repair cafes, looking at those principles of how do we deliver a circular economy and each of the wellbeing goals through the way that we spend our money. We are spending about £6 billion a year on public sector procurement in Wales. How do we make sure that that £6 billion is not just looking at the lowest cost, but driving these wider societal benefits to well-being? And some interesting things that when a government starts to set this long-term goal, even though our legislation only applies to the public sector, actually the private sector are responding in terms of they like the certainty that it brings. They like the fact that they know where the country is going. They like the fact that there's not going to be a wholesale change during the next election, whatever party gets elected, because those are the long-term goals that span beyond electoral cycles. As a result of that, they've been able to invest, and Wales has gone from being second to last in terms of green job creation to the third best of the UK regions in terms of green job growth. Those are some of the things that can happen when you start to set that long-term vision. And thinking about health and social care as well. A real focus on how can we make those connections between improving health outcomes now and into the future. So connecting children with nature, connecting them with the food that is going to end up on their dinner plate in their free school meals, making sure that that food through our procurement supply chain is connected to local growers and suppliers, and making the learning about that part of the school curriculum. This focus on community, investing now to create dementia-friendly communities for current generations, and the significant increase we're likely to see in dementia in the future. Making sure that we have the right sort of facilities that are being built now to accommodate the increasingly aging population. And then some interesting things around just that kind of human or human to animal connection, if you like. This is a project which is connecting people in care homes with animals, twilight barking. And some of the outcomes from this, plus intergenerational programs that are starting to happen now, really focusing on that human connection, the social and human capital, really starting to reap results. One program which paired children in quite a difficult school who have difficult backgrounds with an elder care facility in that kind of regular interaction each week where they build friendships, relationships and connections, saw a 50% reduction in the use of antipsychotic medication in that care home and reduced attendances to hospital alongside improved attendances of children in that school and improved behaviour. This is kind of like, it's a fairly low-cost thing to do, but it's about thinking differently in terms of how do we support well-being. So this is really a growing movement. Wales was the first country to legislate on future generations, but there are now a number of countries across the world who are trialling this. This quote from Milton Friedman, who I'm not a fan of generally, but I think this sort of spells things out really well. Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. And when that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. So I suppose what we started to do in Wales is to develop what those ideas might be. How is there a different way to consider how we do public policy? A different way to consider how we might be, what we might be leaving behind to future generations. And in September last year, the United Nations passed the world's first declaration on future generations, so drawing heavily from this work and committing countries to putting in place arrangements in the development, implementation, evaluation and assessment of all policies to safeguard the interests of future generations. Now, if we take that to the letter, and Norway is a country that has signed up to this, this says that permeates really everything that we do. We must be considering how future generations, how our work and our actions are playing out for future generations. In terms of that global movement, this is what the picture looked like in terms of countries starting to work in this space in 2023. And in 2025, this is spreading even further. So the question is, could we bring something like this to Norway? I think it's entirely possible that we could do this. In fact, your Citizens' Assembly on the Sovereign Wealth Fund called for exactly this. A really good example, actually, of a country investing for the long term, investing to pass something on to future generations. As we move towards net zero, how does that need to change? And how does that need to be reformed to act in the interests of future generations? And if we do that, these are some of the benefits. So we see that across the board, there is strong public support for this. This type of approach helps to build capability in the system. It helps to think differently about the sort of public leadership that we see. And we're starting to see, therefore, this kind of coalition of early adopters really advancing this work. And if we do this, if we embed this type of thinking, again, we start to see increased public trust and collective vision. It's really interesting. We have national indicators in Wales which map our progress against achieving these wellbeing goals. Against all of the odds and the rest of the kind of global indicators, the perception amongst young people aged 16 to 25 and those from Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities in terms of their ability to influence decisions in their lives and in their area is actually increased in Wales, which bucks the trend. So when we start taking that long-term view, we can start to grapple with some of these issues. If this is something that you're interested in advocating for, this model sets out learning that we've taken with colleagues from across the world, countries that are trying to do something similar. This is called the foresight prism. So if we want to activate something like this, citizens need to be involved in shaping visions for their futures. We need to be bringing people together, having those conversations. We need to be bringing different groups from civil society together so that the environmental NGOs are talking to the poverty NGOs and the democracy NGOs, and all of recognizing the intersection between them all. We need to be identifying who are the political champions, who are the people who can see that their role in being elected now is not just for now, but it's for those who are yet to be born and those coming behind them. And then we need to build capacity and capability in the system, because I wouldn't mind betting that very, very few of your officials that you work with in your municipalities and who you work with in government have ever been on a foresight training programme, or have ever been asked to consider things in a very holistic way, develop indicators, and so on. So we really need to think about what are the tools and the frameworks and the training and capacity building that we might need in the system. All of this really is designed to ensure that we are giving these kids a better future, that we're acting today for a better tomorrow, and I really believe that's something that can be done here in Norway. Thank you very much.